Now, before I start on the next couple of reality benders, it's important to understand that what's bending your reality is the actual proven reality of biblical prophecy. In other words, the prophecy existed before the events prophesied actually occurred. So the reality is that the prophets of the Bible were actually able to foretell future world history. And that's why I spend a little bit of time showing you that reality. Now, for years, history and archaeology were dominated by the quite arbitrary atheistic thought that prophecy must be impossible. Therefore, any historical reference to an event could only ever possibly be written after the event, because they didn't believe prophecy was possible. Now, consequently, it was just assumed by these skeptics that the book of Daniel could only be a fake and written sometime after 74 AD. That is, sometime after the events prophesied in it, and not around 530 BC that all the evidence actually points to. Now, the other error this skeptical school of thought tries to hold onto is the myth that later copies of earlier documents must always contain many errors because of the copying process. Because they say so. Now, oddly, they seem to have gone very quiet, since both science and archaeology has proven them to be very much mistaken on both counts. Until 1947, the earliest surviving copies of the Jewish scriptures existing were the Masoretic text, named after the Jewish scribes, whose task it was to faithfully and accurately preserve the Jewish scripture texts. Now, however, these copies were dated around 980 to 1008 AD. But in 1947, a remarkable discovery was made at a place near the Dead Sea called Qumran. They found several caves full of relatively well-preserved biblical and non-biblical scrolls and documents that became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, among them they found every book of the Jewish scripture except Esther. Every book of the Jewish scripture, which is our biblical Old Testament. Now, paleographic study of these documents, also verified by the less reliable but nonetheless supportive carbon dating process, confirms they range in age from around 250 BC to 70 AD. Now, the first thing that they confirmed was that the Masoretic text was exceedingly, almost superhumanly accurate. For instance, an intact copy of Isaiah found among the scrolls is reported to have yielded only 17 minor letter variations over the entire 66 chapters of this lengthy document, with none of them having any discernible effect on the content whatsoever. This proved that scriptural text can be, and in fact was, accurately transcribed over hundreds of years without discernible error ever being introduced. Now, something else they found had a much greater impact. Among the scrolls they found no less than 8 copies of the Book of Daniel, dated as early as 165 BC. That's before Christ. Not only that, but the relatively copious remains of the Book of Daniel indicate that the importance of this book to the Qumran community. There are clear indications that this book was considered authoritative scripture for the community, on a par with other authorized books of the Jewish canon, such as Deuteronomy, Kings, Isaiah, Psalms, etc. Now, one fragment that they found also employs the quotation, which was written in the book of Daniel the prophet. This phrase, which is similar to Jesus' reference to Daniel the prophet in Matthew 24:15, was a formula typically applied at Qumran to quotations from the canon of accepted scripture. Such acceptance as the genuine writings of a prophet of the Lord is not something that happens overnight, but over a long period of testing, examination, verification, authorization, etc. Now, while 8 copies of the Book of Daniel at Qumran were scientifically dated around 165 BC, it is clear they were authorized and verified copies of a much earlier, more ancient and existent document. As further verification of this fact, the linguistics and style of Aramaic and Hebrew used in the Dead Sea Scroll copies of Daniel also denotes a much earlier writing date. Chapters 2:4 through to chapters 7:28 are written in the ancient Aramaic language known as Chaldee, which is the language of Babylon, the same language used in documents of the 7th century BC, which is around the time of Daniel. Adding to the bountiful evidence that the original copy of the Book of Daniel was truly written sometime around or before 530 BC, is the fact that the prophet Ezekiel, a contemporary of Daniel, although not in Babylon, in his account also makes mention of Daniel, giving him prophetic status on a par with Noah and Job, and by seeing no need to explain who Daniel was, indicated he was already well and widely known and highly regarded in his own lifetime. But, for our purposes today, it's sufficient that the Book of Daniel clearly and unequivocally physically existed around 165 BC. Indeed, parts of those very documents still exist today. In other words, even by extremely conservative standards, we have scientific proof the written prophecy of Daniel physically existed, at the very least, 165 years before Christ was even born, and around 197 years before he entered Jerusalem as its king and Messiah in the month of Nisan, the month of the Passover, in 32 AD, and there to be crucified. Now, many prophecies merely detail future events that are to occur sometime in the near or far future. But chapter 9 of Daniel goes even further and actually sets dates when this prophecy is to occur. Dates that have been scientifically proven beyond doubt were well after the Book of Daniel was written. That is, the prophecy actually existed in real, actual world reality a great many years before the events prophesied eventually occurred exactly as and when prophesied. Now, it's important to remember when we look at 2 of these prophecies in the next 2 videos that it has been scientifically proven from existent factual and physical evidence that Daniel's prophecies did indeed exist as part of physical world reality a great many years, indeed hundreds of years, before the prophecies came to pass precisely as foretold. That means somebody who knew and could see the future.